video is a little bit different because I'm going to share with you one of the things that I hear sometimes said in jiu-jitsu that just irritates me, makes me roll my eyes, and then I also want to share an idea on it, and then at the end I'm going to ask you a question too. So recently at a competition, one of my white belts was competing, and he pulled guard and was just throwing up submission after submission, and we looked pretty good. He ended up winning the match by points, but again, looked pretty good for his first competition. And I didn't think anything of it. A couple of my students said that because this was a local tournament, they said that they were watching a live feed of that match from the other team's perspective, like one of the other teammates on his opponent's team was there recording it on like Facebook or something, and said that, while he was pulling guard, and it wasn't a pretty guard pull. I mean, again, this is his first competition. He's like flopping back a little bit. But the people were chiming in like, oh, this is so stupid. This would never work on the street, this kind of thing, right? And, that kind of stuff, like for a sport jiu-jitsu competition wouldn't work on the street. It makes me roll my eyes. First off, because again, this is very conditional, right? It's people are very conditional with when they want to draw like the lines in the sand, right? Because if their guy had been pulling guard and winning, they probably wouldn't care. It's like people with like the refs. If the ref is making bad calls, but as long as it's beneficial to their team, they don't even care. But as soon as they have a bad one for their team, then it's a problem, right? People, their ethics and their ideas are typically conditional to what's going on. But I'll digress. But getting back to it, I hear this idea all the time where people say, well, this wouldn't work on the street. And I understand what they say, of course. Like, I would never pull guard in a street fight. Of course not, never. And I've been in street altercations. I've been in MMA fights. I'd never once have I pulled guard, never. I have students that are police officers. They've never once pulled guard, right? They do in the gym, but they don't, out there. They've been in MMA. Some of them have fought MMA, don't pull guard. I have MMA fighters that play around in here and they'll pull guard. When they go to MMA fights, they go for takedowns and everything else. They don't do that, right? But being in a sport jiu-jitsu competition and being in a street fight are two different situations, right? They're not even close to the same thing. There's lessons and there's things that we can take away from the sport jiu-jitsu aspect that can serve us should we fight in a street fight, right? Or an MMA fight or whatever it could be, like the ability to deal with the chaos of someone trying to grab you and everything else. But it's not the same thing. Of course not. And I don't know why people would say it that way, as if you can't be both, right? Like, for instance, Chris Howder was on the Jiu-Jitsu podcast recently, and he was on the podcast, and he was saying that, he has this philosophy where you can train sport, but you always stay street, basically, where, you're remembering you're doing sport jiu-jitsu because at a certain point, you're no longer doing jiu-jitsu for self-defense, because at some point you're like, look, I can handle myself. I'm doing this now because I enjoy rolling and I enjoy doing jiu-jitsu against jiu-jitsu, right? But at the same time, how does this work in a fight situation? Just always remembering that that's a possibility, right? And just kind of keeping that in the back of your head. And for me, like, I would do sport jiu-jitsu competitions, and then a couple weeks later, I would do an MMA fight, and my game would just have to be adjusted a little bit for the distance. But again, it's not like I can't adjust it, because honestly, sport jiu-jitsu competitions are much more complicated because of the limitations of no punching and everything else than an MMA fight. The MMA fight is more intense, but typically the ground stuff is a little bit more simplistic than the jiu-jitsu competitions, right? But you can be both. You can see there's plenty of good sport jiu-jitsu competitors that then move over to fighting, and there's even some fighters who then later on get into sport jiu-jitsu competitions and they do fine, right? You just start to change the game a little bit. But this idea that you can't do both, or that, you're going to go to a sport jiu-jitsu competition and not use sport jiu-jitsu is just silly. It's a silly argument. But the reason I bring that up is because I think it's dumb, and I know a lot of people that are watching this that are new understand. Some people will try to draw the line in the sand and say you have to be this way or that way, right? They're trying to split you apart so that they can make you think their thing instead of this thing, right? Be both. Be whatever you want to be, right? If you want to go full self-defense, if you want to go full sport, that's fine. Do whatever you want to do. But understand, you can do both. You can be a fighter, you can use jiu-jitsu in fight situations, and you can also play sport jiu-jitsu. Perfectly fine. But here's what I would ask you guys. I'm just curious what would bring up. What have you heard said about jiu-jitsu or grappling in general that just makes you just go, oh my God, like roll your eyes? Like, whether it's in the jiu-jitsu community, saying about the other jiu-jitsu community, or if it's from someone from like another martial art saying it about jiu-jitsu. I'm curious to what you guys have. I don't do these videos very often. I'm asking you guys for input, but I just thought it would be funny just because that's one that comes up all the time in jiu-jitsu where, you'll have one side of the argument like, well, would that work on the street? And like, no, because we're not going to use this on the street. We're using this for sport. You do something else on the street. But then there's other stuff I know that's out there. So if you guys got anything fun, throw it down in the comments below, and I'll chime in there with you guys later on. But again, I just wanted to share that idea, that story one, so that if you're newer, understand you can play in all the realms. You can be in both. You don't have to just be one. And then just see what you guys come up with as well. So that's that. I'll talk to you guys next time.